Hi my lovelies, thank you so much for joining me. As ever, I appreciate every single one of you who's coming to my channel, but for those of you who might not have subscribed yet, why don't you do that? Make sure that you never miss one of my episodes. Also, for those of you who are supporting me on YouTube membership and Patreon, I hope you're enjoying all your full-length extra videos that you're getting there. I appreciate every single one of you who has joined to become a member, and I'm putting more and more content out constantly, but without you, I can't do this. You are massively appreciated. Just giving you a heads up, my The Serial Killer Next Door book is available online and in lots of big bookshops all across the UK, and it's going out in America in October. I just want to say a massive thank you for all your support. It has been blindsiding, it has been humbling, and it has been utterly amazing. Thank you so much. You can also get it on audiobooks if you fancy that, or you can wait for the softback to come out in about 3 months' time. I'm wearing my new merch, it's coming up for Christmas. We're all armchair detectives, aren't we? And I just thought I'm going to honour that by creating this merch. There's also new Chase merch and lots of other things that are in the pipeline to be released in the next few weeks. So I sponsored my own video today, and why not? Let's talk about this case, which is absolutely horrific. I don't even know how to phrase it in any other way. And I feel deeply frustrated in this case, as I did in the case I covered on Kaylee Titford in the UK, a 16-year-old who basically died because of horrific neglect. And one of the things that really takes my breath away is, how are people not seeing this happen? And ultimately, what is the appropriate sentence where parents are so disregarding of the care and safeguarding of their own child that they let them die in front of their eyes, wither away in the most horrific of states in front of their eyes? And that's exactly what we're talking about when we discuss Lacy Fletcher. This is a young woman who, to all intents and purposes, should have been protected by the very people who chose, in my opinion, to callously die in the most torturous of circumstances in the home that they should have been giving respite and sanctuary to Lacy within. So let's talk about our victim. And she is a victim. We're going to refer to her in that way, just as we would if somebody had walked into somebody's home and shot them. As far as I'm concerned, the level that we're talking about in this case, this is a homicide, no matter what the results of any court case will tell you. So Lacy Ellen Fletcher, she was born on the 25th of November 1985, and she was born to parents that she should have been able to trust, Clay and Sheila Fletcher. She lived in quite a small town of a place called Slaughter, Louisiana. The population is actually less than 1,000 people, so that is going to be a place where literally everyone knows one another. And I think that for the majority of us, we can see both sides of how that would be. Personally, I love saying hi to people that I know on the street. I love the tittle-tattle that I hear when people are gossiping about this happening and that happening. I love the community experience of just seeing people that smile at me, that I recognize, that I don't necessarily know, but I feel safe within because they're familiar. I like small town communities. I also know that when my boys were growing up and they got themselves into a few little altercations here and there, everyone found out about it because that's how it works. So there are good and bad things about living in a small town. Clay, he worked for a non-profit organisation called Baton Rouge Civil War Roundtable. And apparently that organisation had this mission to educate and foster an appreciation for the sacrifices made in the Civil War. He was also on the town's planning and zoning committee. So clearly somebody who was well known and somebody who liked to be involved on a local community level. And that means that he was an individual that would have been quite trusted. I would imagine that people looked at him and in his direction as an individual who they could confidently rely on because he's engaged in these areas. Sheila, well, she was a police and county clerk in the small nearby city of Baker. She later actually got a job as an assistant to the city prosecutor in Zachary, it's another nearby town. She was also a town alderman, which meant that she was a member of the municipal council. So again, we're talking about people who would be considered upstanding citizens, you know, the kind of individuals that you could rely on, the kind of individuals we would all want for neighbours, because they're the individuals that you know you can count on, ideally in a crisis or for information, or that you can confidently assert are going to be decent human beings who probably keep a nice lawn. The family also regularly attended a nearby Baptist church, so they're people of God, we can say. A close friend called Jess Easley, this is somebody who actually knew the Fletchers for 25 years, she said Clay and Sheila were like your model citizens. And from what I've just described, absolutely, they come across as if they are. But then again, BTK was somebody whose local church thought a lot about him, and he was a serial killer. So what you think you know about someone doesn't actually mean you know them at all. We can be super nice people 95% of the time, and we can be heinous human beings 5% of the time. If you're unlucky enough to be with that human being that 5% of the time, well, your experience of them is going to be very different to the experience that others have around them. When it came down to Lacy's childhood, she attended Brownsville Baptist Academy in Louisiana. That's a small private school. She was actually a member of the school volleyball team. So just allow this to sink in when I'm talking about her, because we need to have this picture of who she was so that we have a comparison with who she becomes and why she becomes that. So a member of the school volleyball team, just think about team sports. You have to be able to be good at what you do. You have to be coordinated to a degree. You have to be able to work as a member of a team. You have to get on with your teammates. There's a whole host of things that are required skill-wise to fit into a team. Apparently, she had a lot of friends, and this wasn't just in school. She had friends in school, and she had friends outside of school. Robert Blaze, who's a neighbor of the Fletcher family, they had sons around Lacy's age, and he said she was one of those kids that appeared to be really happy. She liked fun things, she liked playing. So we're looking back at a young childhood, early childhood, pre-11. She is thriving. There is nothing completely different about her compared to her peers. There are no notable differences that people are really picking up on. She just fits in. She's just living her life. She's thriving. She's happy. Now, a friend from her school, she said that one of the things that really stood out about Lacy is the way that she treated newcomers to the school. Now, everybody can remember a moment where a child has been brought to a new school. You might be in the third year of being at the place where you're actually being educated, and then all of a sudden this bright new shiny person is introduced into your class. And they usually make a point of getting somebody to show that person around like they're a buddy. But even though for like 5 minutes that person might be popular because, hey, there's so much to find out about that individual, it can be really isolating for children who start new schools. It can be really abandoning, and it can be really hostile on a whole heap of emotional and psychological levels. But Lacy must have understood that, because when newcomers came to the school, she went out of her way to make people feel at ease. That speaks of a very compassionate and also a very empathetic mindset, somebody who sees the challenges a new student would experience and wants to create an opportunity to form a bridge between that person arriving and that person starting to feel at ease in the setting. That same person said, I remember Lacy as a sweet, kind person. She was one of the first people that I was friends with when I started at the school, and she was already there. So an example of somebody who'd been through just that, making a stranger feel like a friend. Now, in 2000, Lacy's parents actually took her to see a clinical psychologist, a guy called Donald Hope. This is when she was 14 years of age. Now, at 14 years of age, let's be honest, everything has changed. And I mean everything changes on a psychological, emotional, social, relational, and educational level. Everything in your world is shifting. You are growing into the human being that you are developing into as a young adult, and that can be overwhelming. There are a lot more expectations placed on you academically. Everybody is starting to navigate relationships in a slightly different way. Some people are actually seeing people in their life and hanging out with boys or girls that they're spending lots of time with intimately. Others are still wanting to climb trees. It can be such a transformative but such a different experience for each 14-year-old, and you're all trying to coexist in that same moment at that same age with all of these different things going on for you. Now, from that first consultation with that particular psychologist, Sheila actually shared information that they had seen another psychologist before this, and Lacy had apparently a below average IQ and had also been registered as being autistic. So essentially, that was the story that was told, that she was struggling academically and also was on the spectrum. Now, Dr. Hope actually ended up seeing Lacy for 12 sessions. That was between 2000 and 2002. 12 sessions is not a lot, is it? We're talking about once every couple of months. So the idea that you're going to have any real relationship with somebody that you have such intermittent experience with is unlikely. But it does show that at that moment in time, there must have been something going on in the home and the relationship with her parents and her education for her parents to feel that it's important for them to take her to a psychologist and to ideally figure out what's going on. Also, let's be clear, people with lower IQs often just don't fit the way the quotient tests. There are so many people out there who are unbelievably bright, but if you give them an IQ test, they'll come out with a low IQ. It's just because they only measure a certain element of our intelligence, and everybody knows that intelligence is absolutely far reaching. So you can't consequently say this person is clever, this person is less clever. It just means that the areas that people measure, some people excel and some people fail at. Now that time in 2002 when she saw Dr. Hope was the last time Lacy ever saw a doctor, a medical professional, a therapist. So this is where her, I suppose, connection with any wider services ends. Robert Blades, who was one of the neighbours and obviously had kids himself, so was used to her being around when the kids were little, he said there seemed to be a change in her. From hanging out with a lot of kids, she hardly ever had any friends that went over to see her. She was definitely different from other kids her age. I knew she wasn't your typical teenager. She was smart, but she wasn't mature. She still liked children things, but not teenage things. When she was 17, she was more into Disney movies and country music. So automatically, we can see there is a transition in her teenage years. Now, this is not uncommon if you are an individual who, shall we say, is on the spectrum. Your interests may not follow the absolute typical path, not that anyone's ever normal, of a teenager going through a more neurotypical experience. But equally, there are so many young people who are less mature when it comes down to wanting the more grown-up things in life. There is nothing wrong with a 17-year-old still loving Disney movies. The truth is, lots of people feel that way. If you go to Disneyland, you will literally see 55-year-old men and women wearing Mickey Mouse ears with all the badges they've collected, and they're there for the 25th time because they like to connect with the joy of being a child, and they still have that child within them. So even though she's not into all the, shall we say, grown-up stuff that teens get into, there's nothing massively unusual about her. Her interests lie elsewhere, but one of the things that is notable is she's becoming more isolated. And when we think about isolation, one of the things that separates us from our peers is common interests. So she probably was ultimately feeling marginalized. She isn't wanting to go out as much as her friends. She doesn't have that mindset at that moment where she's thinking potentially about relationships. She likes what she has in her own world, which is her Disney movies, her country music, and keeping her world small. But like I said, that's not uncommon, but it would certainly make her feel more isolated. And of course, we can also suggest that there could be some mental health issues creeping in there. She may have been suffering from anxiety. She might have had a lower mood. Again, that's contextual when you are growing up. Even if you're on the spectrum or you have additional issues on top of just being that age group, it can mean that your actions and behaviours shift dramatically from when you are a child. It's as simple as that. We've all been there. We know what it's like to be a teenager. When Lacy was in her 9th grade, one of the things that I think dramatically changes her life is that Clay and Sheila pull her out of school, and they decide to start homeschooling her instead. Now, I am a huge advocate of homeschooling. Before I go into this, I don't want anybody watching this and feeling offended that I'm talking about homeschooling in a negative way. I don't have negative views on the whole towards home education. I think it's a brilliant idea. I think lots of times children thrive in those experiences as long as they've got lots of social interaction elsewhere with kids. And I actually think that many parents feel that they want to educate their children differently to how the system educates their kids. So I'm on board. But it can also create a marked change for a child who is used to being socialized, who is used to having friends, who is used to being educated in a particular way, to then be taken to home, and where parents may not, shall we say, have the understanding, the education, the capabilities to express what you need to learn in a way that's going to help you digest it. That in itself can be really problematic. So unless you have the actual support mechanism in place, home ed is going to be very hard. And let's add to that, that this is at a point in time where she's going through some changes and transitions. She's obviously seen a psychologist. She's got some extra needs, shall we say, because of diagnosis. And on top of that, she's withdrawing a little bit. That could mean that on a personality level, she's becoming more resistant to engagement. And if you're trying to engage a child in home education, you're going to have the resources and the capability to manage that kind of scenario so the child doesn't fully resist what you're trying to engage with them over. And that's the best case scenario there. What if you remove your child from school because you don't like the fact that they're not doing that well? Because let's be honest, parents struggle when their child isn't thriving and succeeding. And the parents that we're talking about in this case, they're individuals who've done okay. They're upstanding members of the community. They're the people that friends say, you couldn't get better neighbours, you couldn't get better people, totally reliant. So suddenly having a child who is not typical is beautiful and brilliant in her own way, but is not typical, is not excelling, has some additional needs. Maybe one of the reasons for removing her from school is because they don't like the fact that she is not making the grade. Even if it's not something they're absolutely 100% conscious of, it could be within them that sense of unease. Our child is different and they don't like it. And of course, if you get your child out of school, you don't have to worry about that anymore. Should you have the resources? Should you have the support structure? Should you have socialization experiences and opportunities around you? It should be great. But if you don't, that can absolutely lead to bigger problems. So now, as she's at home being schooled, the prying eyes, shall we say, of the authorities are no longer present. So at this point, according to people who knew Lacy, she pretty much vanished from view in Slaughter, Louisiana, altogether. So no one knows where she's gone. No one knows what she's doing. No one's following up on this girl. She just vanishes. Now, in 2010, Clay and Sheila returned to the psychologist, Dr. Hope. Now, at this point, their daughter wasn't with them. So they then have this conversation with the psychologist and they say Lacy's refusing to leave the house. In particular, she's refusing to leave the living room. They also said that she was urinating and defecating on the floor. Now, this is a massive transition. And I appreciate that the parents would be absolutely horrified by this transition in behaviour, particularly the fact that she's apparently defecating and urinating on the floor. But for that psychologist, there's not much that he can actually do if he doesn't have the patient present. And also, there's no magic wand in those circumstances because clearly there was something very problematic going on for Lacy in that moment. If it's the fact that she's struggling to control her bladder and bowels, well, she needs some kind of medical attention. If it's psychologically symptomatic because she's dealing with feeling very depressed, withdrawn, her self-esteem's on the floor, so she just doesn't think or care about those needs, and that results in that very extreme behavior, that needs treatment. But this psychologist is not going to be able to do anything without the patient present. And I suppose we can also bring in the idea, well, that shows that the parents were concerned for her well-being. But if I had a child, and I'm sure if you had a child, who was literally refusing to leave a room and was defecating and urinating on the floor and was resistant to any engagement at the moment in time, let me tell you, if my child was doing any of that, and I felt I was overwhelmed and out of my depth because I didn't know what was happening, I would be calling on the services of the professionals because I want my children to be okay. And sometimes, it's above my pay grade. Sometimes I haven't got the answer. But I wouldn't be going and seeing a psychologist and saying, hey, can you give me some tips? I'd be saying, can somebody please come to my house and deal with what's going on because I am really struggling. And people can say, well, you know what? It's all dependent on aim frames because, for example, when somebody gets to 18, that would not be possible because that person's within their own rights to live the way they want. Not in my house. Not in my house. That would be something that I would consider a health risk. So there are lots of things that you could be doing, even if you had a child who was now 18 plus, that could prevent that situation getting even more out of control. But what I'm saying is at that moment, they are living in a situation that is apparently so problematic that they have a daughter incredibly resistant to what they want to happen and change and who's got big problems with their personal hygiene. Like I said, according to the parents. Now, Robert Blades, that same neighbour who commented about the fact that he'd seen her going through some changes, he said the last time he actually physically saw Lacy was around 2017. Now, at this point, she would be 21 years of age. He said that she was actually exercising in the road outside her house. He said that she was carrying small weights around the neighbourhood. And he said, you know, she was always pretty thin, but for him, when he looked at her, she looked fairly physically normal. Now, whenever I hear somebody say that they noticed that somebody was exercising and they looked pretty thin, there is always that part of my brain that says, are we also dealing with a young woman who was struggling with an eating disorder? I can't state that that was absolutely the case. So when anybody mentions those kind of issues, when we're thinking about the context of a case like this, it does make me wonder whether Lacy was having some struggles with her self-esteem, with her self-image, with her eating. And also it feels like there might have been some obsessive tendencies where she is concerned. And I can completely understand that if you are parents dealing with somebody with multiple issues like that, that can be deeply challenging for you on a psychological level. But if this is going on throughout her teens, and now we're in young adulthood, and there are obviously problems, there should be intervention. No matter whether she's over 18 or otherwise, there should be intervention. And what we know from psychological research is the earlier you intervene in these situations, the better the outcome.
Oh, you about 10, 15 years ago. I don't really remember exactly, but a long time.
And what did she look like?
I don't know, she just looked like a young woman. She was, she had these little, what do you call the little weights that you hold in your hand? The little dumbbell. She'd walk from her house around the circle, and she used to do that, you know, I don't know, 2 or 3 times a week. She was a sweet girl. The few times that I talked to her, you know. But like I said, she didn't come out a lot.
Now, 5 years after that neighbour saw Lacy Fletcher doing those exercises and then hadn't seen her since, he actually went and challenged Clay Fletcher, Lacy's father, on where his daughter was. He said, I asked Clay, because I hadn't seen her for so long. I actually thought maybe she got married and moved on. I said, how's Lacy? How's she doing? Has she moved off, went to college or what? He replied, oh no, she's still here. She's fine. And then he changes the subject, and that's it. And he didn't go on to explain why Lacy hadn't been seen, why she wasn't outside. And it just demonstrates that Clay is absolutely aware that his daughter is not being seen by anybody because she isn't leaving the home, and that it's causing some questions. And he ultimately chooses not to go into detail as to what's happening or why she isn't being present in the community, because it's an uncomfortable conversation to have. But when those kind of situations arise, it's up to us looking in from the outside to do something about it. If Clay isn't going to go into detail, but this particular neighbour is aware that something must be going on, making those calls, telling services and authorities that something might not be right, it is so acutely important. We get to 2 a.m. on the 3rd of January 2022. This is when a 911 call is made. Sheila calls them, and she, on this call, states that she'd found Lacy. She said that she found her not breathing on the sofa. Emergency services arrive, and they discover what can only be described as one of the most harrowing scenes that any of the first responders will have ever encountered. And it will be something so rare that I would doubt any of them will ever encounter anything similar again. And bear in mind, one of the really disconcerting things about the 911 call is, as far as I'm concerned, it's clear that they're not doing CPR on Lacy at all. It's clear they're just making it up. You can hear both parents talking, and this weird noise is happening, and it doesn't sound like anything you'd expect where chest compressions are concerned. And in fact, it will be impossible, as I will describe shortly, to have actually carried out CPR on Lacy. So again, keep that in mind. I'm talking about a mother calling emergency services to report that she's found her daughter not breathing. Where would you be psychologically? How will you feel emotionally in that moment? You would be absolutely traumatized, horrified, panicking, devastated, pleading with God, anything to just make sure their child is going to be okay. None of that. The last thing you'd probably be doing is thinking, how do I stage CPR? That talks of something, in my opinion, so dark, so disconnected, that the inhumanity is almost impossible to portray to you. It really is, to get across to you. But that's what we're talking about. Those emergency responders, they arrive and they're brought in to see where Lacy is, because of course she's been found non-responsive. And what they see is something genuinely out of a horror movie. As you'll note from the pictures that I put up, whilst they're not fully exposing the scene, you can make out exactly how Lacy looks. It is like you are looking at some kind of prop, something that's been created for some horror film. She was partially clothed. She was absolutely malnourished beyond belief. When you think about those horrific pictures that we've seen from concentration camps and prisoner of war camps, you're talking about her looking worse than that. Her malnourished, devastated body was literally fused into the family's maggot-infested leather couch. And I mean maggot-infested leather couch. And one part of the couch is just absolutely sunken in. And the reason that that is sunken in is it's got her bodily waste. Reams and reams and reams of bodily waste. Her body weighed a mere 44 kilograms. It's absolutely astonishing. And it was obvious that she'd been utterly neglected. When they actually examined her just on scene, it was clear she had ulcers on her underside. She had fecal matter that had all been crushed into her face, into her chest, into her abdomen, literally caked in it, layer after layer after layer. Imagine you're coming in to try to bring somebody back to life or try to save somebody's life or at least deal with somebody just after death. You're walking in thinking this is going to be a tragedy unfolding. This is going to be terrible. How awful for the parents. This is a relatively young person. You're not going to walk in and think, I'm going to see somebody who has been so dehumanized, so neglected, so diabolically treated and ignored that I am going to struggle to understand that what I'm looking at could ever once have been an actual human. They determined that Lacy, at this point, had been dead for 1 to 2 days before Sheila had eventually called 911. So those chest compressions that they were apparently doing, clearly they weren't, because she'd been dead for a couple of days at least. At this point, Lacy Fletcher was 36 years old. 36, a young woman. Now, one of the neighbours, Robert Blades, he actually theorised that, as far as he was concerned, Sheila was likely forced to make the 911 call. He said that there started to be talk. People were getting a little bit tetchy about the fact that this girl who'd grown up and was apparently still living at home was never seen. And allegedly there was one neighbour, they don't know which neighbour it was, they had supposedly looked through the window and they'd seen Lacy on the couch. So they'd actually physically seen this skeleton-like person decaying to some degree on the couch. And they'd actually had that conversation. They'd risked offending and actually made it very difficult and challenging for the parents by saying, listen, I've seen this, you need to call the police. So it doesn't even sound, at least anecdotally, that the parents would have taken that much action at all had they not found themselves in a situation where somebody else may have blew the whistle. Because you're in hot water anyway if there is a child so neglected that she has decayed on the family couch under your watch. But at least if you make the call, there is some accountability. If a neighbour does that for you because they've seen it and you did nothing at all, well, that makes you even more disturbing to the human being that you actually are. Although evidently the human being that you actually are is utterly disturbing nonetheless. When it came down to how that poor young woman's body was found, Sheriff Jeffrey Travis, he said, I have been a sheriff for 6 years. I've had a lot of things happen here in East Flintshire Parish. But this type of scene, this is by far the worst. Coroner Dr. Ewell Bickham, as you'll see from the video, he was absolutely broken by this. The fact that He opened the door. He immediately knew that something terrible was going on, that something horrendous had happened, because there was a stench of odor, of feces, of fecal material, of urine. You literally couldn't hold your breath. It was so diabolical. And that particular coroner has been devastated by what he's experienced. He cannot believe that anybody could do that to another human being.
I walk in on the scene after Officer Dalton Corbin called me from Slaughter PD as I was dispatched. I arrived within 10 minutes. I arrived before Kate and the ambulance there. When I got there, the officers, the first responders on scene were just in a daze. They were just standing there. They were on the outside. When I walked in, the house smelled of a stench of. It smelled like a sewer, a septic tank, and also a smell of death. I've never smelled that in my life. I've dealt with decomposed bodies. I've dealt with all sorts of death, degradation, whatever. Never experienced this in all of my career. When I walked through the door, to the right of me in the kitchen, Clay and Sheila Fletcher were standing there. Clay was standing there emotionless. The mom had her head between her knees. I saw a tear or two. To the left was the living room where Lacy was. I immediately went through there. I didn't stop and socialize with the parents. I went in there to where Lacy was. And
because that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about people who allowed this young woman, who at 21 was seen exercising, who at 11 was considered a lovely, compassionate human being with an empathic soul, who offered her help to others who might have felt isolated. We're talking about somebody who had potential being melted, literally fused to a couch, left to rot in her own feces, urine, bodily fluids, to ulcerate to such a diabolical stage that she died, whilst also decaying physically from malnutrition. And having to go in and deal with that, all the while knowing this is somebody who should be thriving, that's really psychologically challenging to deal with. DA Sam D'Aquila, he stated that most of the images of the crime scene were actually not fit for publication. They were just so horrifying, they were so graphic, they were so traumatizing that to allow public release of them would just be too terrible for those people who actually saw the images. And also, I suppose when it comes down to these kind of photographs, it's about making sure that the dignity of the victim is also remembered. Because when we look at these crime scene photographs, it's really hard to not just try to make it an academic experience, because you don't want to take it to heart, because it can be deeply traumatizing and we can suffer from vicarious trauma. So what we tend to do is try to just look at the image and not place the humanity within it, just to kind of see it as we would do a horror scene on TV. But when you know something so diabolical, so left field, so unusual has occurred, and you look at those photographs, it's more than, because you're looking at the demise of a human being over a protracted period of time in the most hellish of scenarios, with a look at the end of their life as to something that compares more to some model in a horror movie than it does to an actual human being, to an adult female. So I can understand why they decided, for her dignity, not to just release those to the wider public. When you look at the pictures that have been given out, she appears almost buried up to her shoulders in this deep hole in the sofa. Now, bear in mind, the reason that deep hole was there is her body had worn into it over the years. She's obviously slumped over on her left side. She's got her right arm across the top half of what can only be described as a malnourished, emaciated body. She's got no dignity. She's naked, apart from the really small blue pattern t-shirt, and that was pulled up on her chest. It didn't even cover her breasts. And her face was covered in these large and really angry red blotches, clearly infected. And she genuinely had excrement smeared almost over her whole body. It was also matted into her hair. And as I'm saying this, just consider the fact that I'm describing a human being's experience. Imagine your whole body being covered in your own human waste. Imagine your hair being matted to your head, full of feces. Imagine the smell. Imagine the infection. Imagine the pain. Imagine the helplessness that you would feel in those moments. And in that hole that she'd sunken it into, there were excessive amounts of urine and feces all underneath. And that meant that she was literally in a pit of it. And then all the area around the floor and the couch was also covered in her human waste. And these two great neighbours, everybody would like these two to be living next door to us. They had been letting that happen in front of their eyes. They had been watching their daughter dissolve in front of their eyes, and they had been allowing it. Imagine watching your child dissolve. There are lots of words that I could use, but that's probably the one that stands out mostly for me. She was literally decaying into the couch. And people who are meant to love her, people who brought her into this world, people who are meant to care for her, they can smell that. They can see that. They've watched her for years become that. They've done nothing. And astonishingly, to the right-hand side of that description that I've given you of the sofa is a clean grey commode and a neat pile of clothes. So there's this reality playing out where this young woman has absolutely been neglected beyond belief and has become fused to some degree with the couch, has decayed and rotted in this situation over years, and yet there's that neat pile of clothes in a commode. Now, people can say, oh, well, maybe they wanted to try to care for her, maybe there was an issue with her resisting. Can we just be real about this? She was so malnourished that a child could have lifted her up. So that's not going to wash with me. But also, what does that say about the psychology of the caregivers? It's complete disassociation. It's complete denial, complete avoidance. Oh, we'll just leave these clean things there so that it looks like we care, even though we're actually allowing her to just decay in front of our eyes. Also, a few feet in front of the sofa was apparently a black table that had talcum powder on, it had a pack of wipes, it had nasal spray, it had a box with a lid that had a child's photo on. It also had other items in that made it clear that the Fletchers had the resources to clean her. But they didn't. And the reason they didn't is, like I said, psychologically, they've disassociated. She's quiet. She's just disappearing before their eyes. They've washed their hands of her. She isn't the child they birthed. Just consider this, because I appreciate that this has happened and I was not present and I do not know the psychological experience of the parents. So I can only comment from my experience and from what I understand from looking into this case. My thoughts are very clear. They gave birth to a child. They loved that child. That child did really well until 11 years of age, shall we say. And then developmentally, there was a shift. Now, these two are upstanding members of society. They like being considered good people in their community. They want to have a child that excels. They want to have a child that stands out for the right reasons. Apart from the problem is their child isn't academically doing very well. Their child isn't maturing emotionally and developmentally at a rate that is comparable with her peers. And they don't like that. They try to get a bit of help. It's not immediate. It feels concerning to them that they've not got the answers. So they decide one day, oh, you know what? Maybe we'll just hide her away. And maybe over time, the problem will just disappear. And the psychological manifestation of that mindset, of that thought process, is that ultimately and eventually that would have happened. Initially, she disappears from the world around her. She's homeschooled. Then from the community around her. Then from the very people who are actually meant to love her. She just disappears. She gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And people stop talking about her. And to everyone outside in that world, she's just vanished. And if they hadn't been found to have this child by that neighbour who insisted that they call 911, maybe she would have indeed vanished. That psychological disconnection for me prevails over this case and clarifies for me that those parents had disconnected entirely emotionally and just wanted to stop having her as an issue. When they examined her body, her legs were actually crossed, and the reason that her legs were crossed is that her muscles had become so immobile that they'd stiffened and they'd actually stayed that way. And the reason they think that she would have been that way is she'd have been in so much pain, she was trying to lift herself out of her own excrement because it would have been hurting her. Also, when it came down to the food that was around her, well, there wasn't very much at all. In fact, the only food that was seen when first responders and when the police started investigating was some hard candy. And when you're in an emaciated state like that, there's no way your teeth are going to be dealing with hard candy. Also, she must have been desperately hungry, because when they did the autopsy, one of the things that they discovered is that she had her own feces in her stomach and foam from the couch. She'd been pulling at that couch. She'd been eating it. Imagine the torture she was dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And also hold that thought, the fact that she was physically eating her own feces, her own waste, and also the foam, because that's going to play into some of the discrepancies I have regarding what the parents said about why she was in that situation. Now, the autopsy, which must have been absolutely harrowing to carry out, that was carried out by forensic pathologist Dana Troxclair, and the autopsy report just showed a whole host, a litany indeed, of the most terrifying realities that this young girl had to deal with when she was dying. So Lacy's body was covered in pressure ulcers. And as we know, if you're not moved around, your body will get these ulcers. It's very prevalent in people who are elderly and frail and can't move in bed, and they get horrible ulcers that eventually can kill them. And she was also suffering with chronic bone infection with polarizable fibers. So what that means is it was likely fibers from the couch and got into her body. And also she had maggots embedded in the exposed surface of the bones. Can you imagine the agony she was in? She was being eaten. She was being eaten on a couch in her own home with her parents present. In fact, they found maggots present in the perineum and also in areas of the decubitous ulcers. Now, if the maggots had appeared after death, there would have been at least a minimal presence of eggs or larvae in the region of the eyes, in the ears, or the nose. But these areas, together with the wounds, are actually the preferred spots for colonisation, because obviously that's easy access. But harrowingly, there was actually no evidence of decomposition at the time of the autopsy, which you'd expect, wouldn't you? You'd think, oh, if there's maggots there, that's because she's died. And they've got into these areas like the eyes, the nose, all of these areas, they've got particular fluid available initially. That's where they'll have headed for, and that's be why there are maggots there. No. It was deemed that the maggots were literally present prior to her death. She would have been aware of them. She would have known they were moving within her. This is the ultimate horror death. She was being eaten away, like I said, eaten away in a couch in her own home under the watch of her parents. One of the statements that Dr. Troxclair headed in the findings was that she died of severe chronic neglect. She said that Lacy suffered from chronic protein malnutrition and acute starvation. She said there was fecal matter, both crusted and fresh, present on the body, including face, chest, abdomen, perineum, and extremities. So like everywhere. She also described Lacy as being filthy. She had extremely dirty, matted, knotted hair. Again, covered with feces, infested with maggots. Also, she had insect bites to her left ear, her face, her arms, and all of those had happened before she died. That hair matting that had occurred because of the feces and the maggots, it had actually matted into a 24 by 18 inch knotted ball. So you couldn't have brushed it, you couldn't have straightened it. And then she found that underneath that, the scalp was all red and inflamed and crusted. Dr. Troxclair also found fecal matter and also material from the couch, both under Lacy's fingernails and also, as I said, inside her stomach. So she was trying to avoid starvation by basically eating whatever she could, even if that was her own waste, even if that was undigestible couch that she was shoving into her mouth to prevent herself from finally succumbing to this horrific situation. It also speaks of the survival mechanism within us. Because when you think about what I've just described, you would imagine that what she was living is a fate worse than death, that Lacy's day-to-day experience was just a poisonous, grotesque caricature of what she should have expected in that home. And yet still, faced with imminent death, she was trying. She was trying to cling on for dear life, because even in that state, life must have still presented itself as possibly dear to her. And that is just utterly heartbreaking. When it came down to the recording of the cause of death, it was listed as stemming from severe medical neglect, which led to chronic malnutrition, acute starvation, immobility, acute ulcer formation, osteomyelitis, which is a bone infection, and that finally, altogether, led to sepsis. As she was sedentary for all that time, basically her skin had rotted and her bone had rotted, and then the sepsis had killed her. And they believe that that death, that particular cycle, the part that we arrive at in what I've just described, that would have taken several days before she actually died. Just think about that. She's full of bed sores. She's being consciously eaten away by maggots over years, over months, finally over weeks, and then critically over those last several days. It's just incomprehensible. You won't be surprised to hear that Clay and Sheila Fletcher were arrested in January 2022. They were each at that point charged with second-degree murder. That was by a grand jury of 12 in Clinton, Louisiana in May 2022. I get it, because people will say, well, they didn't intend to kill her. Rubbish. Rubbish. I think they were psychologically aware that she was going to die, that it was just a waiting game, and then they were going to get rid of that couch. She was on that couch. She was sunken into that couch. All they would need to do with that frail, tiny, what once was a human being, but no longer looks like a human being, they could just pack it up, get it to a dump, throw it away, never speak of her again. Genuinely. They had let her rot away, decay, become something that looked nothing like a human. It wouldn't have been hard to just remove her completely, physically, from their world when she finally succumbed to the horrific circumstances she'd endured. The idea that they didn't know she was going to die is ludicrous. As everyone said, they were nice people. They were upstanding members of the community. They're not stupid. They're not fools. They know what was happening. They were letting it happen. And finally, they would have had their wish granted. She would have died and they would have made her disappear. That's my opinion. Everyone's entitled to their own. But I don't get second-degree murder. I think they tortured her. I think it is incredibly cruel. And I think they should have got first degree. I genuinely do. They were also released on a $300,000 bond. That was each of them facing that. And in July 2022, they pled not guilty. I have no idea why on God's planet they would think that they were ever going to get away with this kind of horrific neglect and killing. But there we go. That's what they went for, not guilty. Now, astonishingly, in June 2023, the Fletchers were actually due to stand trial. But in that month, District Judge Catherine Jones dropped the charges. This was following a hearing on the 30th of May. Judge Jones basically cited a technicality in the wrong wording of the indictment for this. Had I written that indictment? Did the indictment read, please put them in, I don't know, some kind of human oven for the next 36 years and let's see how they bake? Was that probably a technical issue when it came down to appropriate legal language? Probably. No, I didn't have any involvement in that, guys. I didn't write that particular indictment. If I had, I'm sure I'd have done it in a very professional manner, and there'd have been no mention of some kind of large burning object that they could have been put in for the next 30 odd years. I'm just saying, whatever the technicality was, why is that enough to make a judge throw it out? Anyway, fortunately, DA Sam D'Aquila sought to bring the case back before a different grand jury on the 19th of June and hoped that at this point they'd be arrested on new charges and brought to trial before, at that point, the end of 2023. Now, what actually happened was on the 6th of February 2024, Clay and Sheila both pleaded no contest to the reduced charges of manslaughter. Now, again, I don't get this. I get that we always want to bring people to a point where we can get some kind of justice for the victim. I am not convinced that they should have been allowed at any point to plead no contest to reduced charges of manslaughter, because it ain't manslaughter. This ain't manslaughter. This is torture over a decade at least. Now, the DA, they called for the parents to be jailed immediately after entering their pleas, and rightly so. They're heinous examples of parents who have killed their child. But no, the district judge, Catherine Jones, actually allowed them to continue their bond until the 20th of February, at which point they were told they'd have to surrender. Their sentence hearing was set at that point for the 20th of March 2024. Now, DA Sam DeQuilla said, the Fletchers are pleading no contest to the new charges. They had no choice. This is an open and shut case. They allowed their daughter to suffer unbearably on that couch. We want this case to be a message. We want to stand for the people who can't speak for themselves to say this treatment will not be tolerated. Now, when it came down to the defence team, the Fletcher's defence team was headed by Stephen Moore. And the way that he approached it, in my view, was, shall we say, a little bit on the hypocritical side. I'm just saying, Mr. Moore, I know you have to defend people. I appreciate that's your client's right. But I'm just saying, if I was defending them, I probably wouldn't go for the, oh, they loved her so much more than most people ever love anyone. That's the approach. Quote, they, and I think this was slightly inappropriate because I have a very dark sense of humour and I know that you're always going to get this, but I'm not sure he should have led with, they loved their daughter to death. Yes, I think that's probably something we all agree on regarding the fact that they definitely did kill her, but I don't think that you can love your daughter to death in a positive way. I mean, when people say I love them to death, usually that means I'd do anything for them. Watch me, this is my left arm, I'm going to cut it off to prevent them from ever enduring any pain in their life, and I'm going to do it smiling. That's the way that we mean when we're talking about loving somebody to death. We don't mean, I love you to death. What does that mean? That I love you to death. Okay, does that mean that you're going to do anything for me? Not quite. Does it mean that you love me so much that no one else in this world will compare? Not quite. Does it mean that when it comes down to my needs, you're going to meet all of them? It sounds like that should be the case, but actually, if you imagine all the things that you've just said and do exactly the opposite, that's the kind of love you to death that I'm going to do. Do you mean that you're actually going to kill me? You got it. You got it in 4. I'm just going to back slowly away from you now, you very strange excuse for a human being. All I'm saying is that's not how love works with respect. Now, the fact that they used that particular statement, I think they did it because they thought they were being clever, and they're saying they loved this person so much that yes, they killed her, but it came from a really good place, because it does, doesn't it? I mean, if you're not wandering around on a Thursday and a Sunday and a Tuesday going, who can I kill today? In a very loving way. I mean, if that was how it worked, serial killers would be using that excuse. I did indeed murder those several victims, but I murdered them with love. Oh my God, really? Absolutely. It was a loving murder. Well, if you had told us that initially, we would have just said, you just loved them too much. I agree. I'm quite a selfless person. I'm a selfless serial killer. There's a book in that somewhere. Anyway, I digress. You know where I'm going with this. Loved their daughter to death. He said, when you look back at it, you wonder why. How could this happen? It did happen. But at no point did Sheila or Clay Fletcher ever have a single intent to harm their daughter. They love their daughter. I kid you not, guys. The defence actually said that. The defence actually suggested they loved their daughter so much, they didn't feed her, they didn't wash her, they didn't make her safe, they didn't move her, they didn't get medical attention for her, they didn't do CPR when they allegedly called for help, they didn't get any friends round, they didn't have any family reunions to make sure that she was safe, they didn't give her an education, they didn't protect her, they didn't literally do anything. But you know what? That's because they loved her. Because when you're a parent, not feeding, not washing, not protecting, not caring for, not giving your child socialization or education, not making sure that they're safe on every level, that's love. That's what love is, isn't it? I mean, that's why the world works so well in families, because parents are that loving. Honestly, this defense guy really needed to rethink his strategy. I'm just saying that. Now, of course, Sheila and Clay are like, yes, we did. We just absolutely were innocent. We loved her deeply. She was wonderful. We did everything for her. They just maintained their innocence throughout. They said that Lacy was of sound mind. But apparently, even though she was of sound mind, she refused to leave the living room. So she's of sound mind. Is she of sound mind? Absolutely sound mind. Knows exactly what she's doing. What is she doing? She's just sitting on a couch. What else is she doing? Absolutely nothing. She knows she's on a couch, therefore she's on sound mind. I'm wondering that maybe if she's not leaving the couch or the room, that maybe something more deep is going on. Well, you could say that. I'm saying that she's saying, even though she's not actually saying very much, that she's completely sound. So you shut up and I'm innocent. Literally, that's their approach. They also said that when they brought her meals and they set up a potty for her, basically she didn't use them. So I would imagine that they therefore stopped bringing her meals, and also the fact that she literally had her legs fused together basically, so she could never have used a potty. They just left her there to rot in her own waste, but this is their defense. They also said that due to Lacy's age, because basically she was 36 at the time of her death, so their argument is, well, she was a fully competent adult, she could make her own decisions. So do you see how bizarre this, that they're trying to now argue that because she is an adult, she can make her own decisions. So yeah, this is now their bizarre argument. Well, what could we have done? She was 36. She makes her own decisions. Try not to lose control, Emma. Okay, let's have a little round robin. Margaret, what could they have done differently? What's that, Margaret? That's right, Margaret. They could have asked Lacy to leave. She's a grown-up. She's not living by their rules. Therefore, she's not welcome in the home. Go and figure it out yourself, Lacy. Good, Margaret. You get a biscuit for that. What's that, Jeff? Absolutely, Jeff. Call on the professionals. They're taking the food. She's refusing to eat it. She's apparently sitting in her own waste. She needs some help. And clearly, she's not very competent at this point in time because she's doing something that could cause her big problems. So therefore, give 911 a ring. What's that, John? Yes, you're correct. They could have engaged in some kind of discourse with her to make it clear that she needed to be clean and that she needed to use the commode appropriately, or there were going to be some consequences, such as some kind of intervention. All of those are excellent. Thank you very much. You will all be awarded with a certificate later. The fact that they are trying to push this narrative, that this is all Lacy's fault, she made the decision, is actually so disrespectful. It is blindsiding to me. That is like saying to somebody with a suicidal child, at the end of the day, just let them do what they want to do in their bedroom, even if that means they end their life. As a parent, you intervene, whether they are 4, 14, 40, or 104, but not these parents. It was all up to Lacy. She should be allowed to decay in her own feces and urine. They also went on to suggest that she refused medical help. So when they were saying, you know, Lacy, things aren't looking good, you're not looking well, she was like, no, I don't want any help whatsoever. And apparently she got really defensive and argumentative when they talked to her about that. So, you know, just leave it. I mean, could you imagine how the world would operate in this way? You think about your partner. You're sitting with them and you're like, have you noticed that you banged your head really badly? Yeah, I fell off those ladders and I hit my head on the floor. I'm actually feeling a bit dizzy. Yeah, I'm just noticing that that lump looks pretty distressing to view. And I think that you might be quite unwell unless you get it treated. You know, it's funny because I can only hear in my right ear and I've lost my vision in my left eye. So things feel a little bit odd. Also, I'm finding basically moving quite difficult. I think you probably need to go to hospital because I think you're seriously unwell. Also, I think you're bleeding. I think that I can see blood pooling around you. Yeah, you know what though? I just can't be bothered. I've got a match to watch and I've got a Netflix series that I'm interested in viewing and I just think I'm going to chill here. Okay, well, I tried. I mean, come on. You just ring an ambulance. It's as simple as that. But they loved her to death. They loved her so much that they didn't give her any treatment. Clay Fletcher actually said her world closed in on her gradually because of her phobias, her fears, her social anxieties. The couch was her sanctuary. It was her comfort zone. Sorry, Clay? It was a comfort zone. The reason she died was because she was so infected by her own fecal matter on that couch. Her body had literally decayed to the bones, that there were infections within the bones, and she decayed in front of your eyes, but apparently she loved it. It was a sanctuary. I mean, if we're not all in a situation where we're in agony, where we're so unwell that our body is literally fusing with a couch, if we're not all thinking, well, that sounds like a great holiday. I mean, come on. But this is the picture they're trying to paint. The lawyer also said that Lacy's social anxiety and autism diagnoses actually contributed to the situation because, let's bring in her mental health issues and a spectrum issue as if that's the reason to allow her to die in front of your eyes. And they also suggested that she reportedly suffered from locked-in syndrome. Now, this is again where my head just falls off, because if we're going to say that according to the parents, she was defensive, she was resistant, she wouldn't engage with them, she wouldn't accept treatment, she was capable, apparently competent, as they put it, to make those decisions, how can you then, as your defense, bring in the idea that she was suffering from locked-in syndrome? So if I'm going to talk about locked-in syndrome, just for those of you who don't know what it is, it's a neurological disorder. It's as simple as that. So it's a really rare disorder of the nervous system, and it is so rare and so debilitating that what happens is it results in the complete and total paralysis, except essentially for eye movement. So you are 100% present. Like, it's terrifying, the idea of having locked-in syndrome, genuinely. You are 100% aware. You know exactly what's happening around you. People can talk to you. You get it. You cannot move a muscle. Just your eyes. So you're mentally aware, you're emotionally aware, you're socially aware of everything that's happening, but you are utterly unable to communicate except using eye movements on some occasions. Now, if that's the case, first of all, Lacy would have needed 24-hour care, end of. And secondly, how is she resisting anything? She's got locked-in syndrome. The defense makes no sense. You're either telling us that she was a resistant, defensive individual who said no to everything, or you're telling us she had locked-in syndrome, meaning she needed absolute attention 24/7 and it was denied in the most grotesque form. When it came down to the sentencing that happened on the 20th of March 2024, they were fortunately sentenced to 40 years in prison. Now, don't get me wrong, 20 years of that sentence is suspended, but thank God, they got 20 years. I genuinely feel like they should have got a lot longer. I genuinely do. I think that she was tortured. I think she was neglected in the most voluminous of ways. I think she was left to decay in the most agonizing way. And I think that no one that I've covered on serial killings have been through a death so traumatic, so torturous, so protracted, so horrific, that it beggars belief I'm talking about a 20-year sentence in prison. Lacy Fletcher was denied everything, every dignity, every opportunity for healthcare, every educational opportunity as a young adult, every community opportunity within her neighborhood. She was denied everything. And finally, she was denied the very thing that every child should have been allowed, no matter their age. She was denied the love and care and compassion of the people that she was born to protect her. In the end, Lacy Fletcher was not loved to death. As far as I'm concerned, she was murdered mercilessly in her own home over months and years of torture. I hope you found this case interesting. I hope I've done Lacy Fletcher justice. If you know more about this, please let me know. I'd be so intrigued to hear more details. I hope if you've listened to this video, you found some additional information compared to other videos that have covered this case. And I just hope that you share the same feelings as I do, which is this is just an absolute abandonment of what being a parent is meant to be about. I send all my love to you. Absolutely devastating case. See you again next time, guys. Look after yourself and be safe.